when I was at your home for the Canada Day festivities, I saw the map of the United States and the extent of each state's trade with Canada. Those numbers were very large practically for every state in the United States. What is the primary trade between Minnesota and Canada?
Sure. Well, 35 out of 50 U.S. states have Canada as their single biggest customer. And this is a huge part of the relationship, is just the magnitude of the commerce that goes on every day between Canada and the U.S. It's almost $2 billion a day of cross-border commerce between our countries. And if you look at what does the United States sell to the world, you sell about 3 times as much to Canada as you do to China, for example. And that's a fact that surprises a lot of people, but it's true. Our economies are so uniquely integrated with supply chains and all kinds of different industries crossing the border. And so 35 out of 50 U.S. states look to Canada as their biggest customer, and that includes Minnesota and the other 4 states that my office covers. Minnesota last year sold almost $6 billion worth of goods to Canada. I think it was a record year for Minnesota's exports of goods to Canada. And so far in 2012, the trend is continuing upwards in terms of Minnesota exports. And you're selling to Canada all kinds of things. Iron ore, ethanol, vehicles, agricultural goods, beef, pork, cereals, all kinds of things are going north into Canada from Minnesota.
What goes the other direction? What comes south from Canada into Minnesota?
Well, lots of different things, but by value, some of the top ones are energy products. For example, just as Canada is by far and away the biggest supplier of oil and natural gas and electricity to the United States as a whole, Canada is also the biggest supplier to Minnesota specifically for oil, natural gas, and electricity. So those 3 products are way up, are up there in terms of Canada's exports, but we also are exporting live animals, oats, vehicle parts, chemicals, fertilizers, you name it. It's a very broad array of trade, of products being traded between Canada and Minnesota. And as I like to point out, that it's not just the products, it's not just the things that are crossing back and forth over the border. There's a lot of investment going in both directions across the border, and this investment relates very much to jobs. Just as the trade relates to jobs, something 160,000 plus jobs in the state of Minnesota are supported directly by the trade with Canada. In addition to that, there's tens of thousands of jobs in Minnesota with companies, Canadian companies, that are invested in this state. And by the same token, we in Canada are delighted that so many Minnesota companies are invested in Canada. Some have been, big household names, have been in Canada for a long time, like 3M, General Mills, Cargill, and others. And some more recent entrants. There's a lot of excitement, for example, about Target moving up to Canada to open many retail stores. But several other Minnesota companies are finding success in the very strong Canadian market.
Here's a point maybe you can comment upon. In the United States, we're often concerned that much of our energy, particularly oil, comes from parts of the world, say the Middle East, where there are unstable regimes who can become unfriendly practically overnight to the United States. Yet on the other hand, we import oil and natural gas from Canada. If you want to talk about the importance of our energy importation from Canada based on sort of a national security terms.
Sure. Well, Canada is now the single largest supplier to the United States of crude oil. More than double, for example, what Saudi Arabia supplies to the United States. And in Canada, you've got a secure, reliable, friendly partner. So I think there's definitely national security benefits to sourcing oil from Canada next door, where you don't have risks associated with some other parts of the world. And beyond these obvious security, reliability benefits, there's also the economic benefit of when you buy energy from Canada, the money is essentially recycled in North America, because Canada being by far and away the biggest customer for what the United States sells, money that goes to Canada to buy oil essentially gets recycled in the North American economy. to the benefit of the United States. Beyond that, there's a lot of U.S. jobs, a lot of U.S. economic activity that is tied to the development of energy resources in Canada. For example, if you look at the oil sands resource in northern Alberta, this is a massive, massive industrial project, essentially, with tens of billions of dollars of investment. And U.S. companies, including companies right here in Minnesota, are heavily engaged in supplying the equipment and services that are needed to develop in a responsible way all those energy reserves.
Give us a little bit about your background. I know you've spent 22 years in the Canadian Foreign Service, but it might be helpful if people understood sort of your route of ascent and the experiences that you've had working in the foreign ministry.
Well, I joined the Canadian Foreign Service in 1990, and I've been lucky to have some terrific assignments both in Ottawa, which is our headquarters, and abroad. My first foreign assignment was to Prague. It was Czechoslovakia when I started in August of 1992, and within a few months it became the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. It was a fascinating time. I served after that in Ottawa for 4 years, then I served in Geneva, Switzerland for 4 years, where I worked primarily on trade policy issues, trade negotiations issues at Canada's office to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. And then I went to Ottawa for 6 years and continued to work on trade policy, trade negotiations in a variety of different capacities before coming here to Minneapolis in summer of 2008.
You have family connections to Minnesota, do you not?
I do. I'm very lucky to have met a Norwegian in '87, and we got married, in fact, in Minnesota. We met in Norway, but a Minnesotan. We got married in the Twin Cities area in 1991, and so I've been very lucky to have made many visits to Minnesota over the years, and so that made it extra special to be offered the position of Canada's Consul General in Minneapolis.
Something that reflects Canada's diversity is the fact that you have a bilingual nation. You speak English, you speak French. What are some of the consequences of serving as a Consul General for a bilingual nation?
Oui, tout à fait. Le Canada, c'est un pays bilingue. Yes, of course, Canada being is a bilingual country, and we're very proud of that. That's an important aspect of our country. And Canadian diplomats serving abroad are expected to be able to speak both languages, and that's important to project Canada and to show people what Canada is all about.
In terms of foreign policy, Canada is strongly aligned with the United States and vice versa. Isn't that true?
Well, our values are the same, and we share space here in North America, which we need to defend, and we work very closely together in the defense of North America. But yes, beyond that, we work very closely to defend and promote our shared values around the world. We're members both of NATO, the North American Treaty Organization. Over the years, our soldiers have fought and died together in the 2 world wars, in Korea, in the former Yugoslavia, more recently in Afghanistan, where Canada for many years was playing a very significant combat role, and we continue to play an important role today, albeit more geared towards development and training. So these are examples of how Canada and the United States are working very closely together. Take Libya, for example, the recent operation, the NATO operation in Libya to support the rebels in their efforts to overthrow Gaddafi. Canada was very closely involved. In fact, not a lot of people know this, but it was a Canadian general who was in charge of the operation from NATO's headquarters, or the base in Italy. Canadian aircraft were heavily engaged, as were Canadian Navy ships, in the activities to support that mission. Something like 10%, in fact, of the sorties of the aircraft runs over Libya in that operation were Royal Canadian Air Force craft.
There's a poignant picture just outside the conference room of an aerial photograph of Juno Beach, June 6, 1944, expressing what you just said, the critical role of Canada in the Second World War. In fact, history serves, or memory serves, Juno was assigned primarily to the Canadians.
Yeah, Canada had a very significant military contribution, both in Navy, Army, Air Force, and a lot of key operations. We played a big role there.
I have a book at home about it's called the Eagle Squadron. That is American volunteers in the RAF in the Battle of Britain, but there are fair number of Americans who went and actually served in the Canadian equivalent to the Royal Air Force, and then went over to Britain to fly as Canadians, Americans flying as Canadians for the British during the Battle of Britain to the United States, got into the war. Interesting, very interesting stuff.
Yeah, and our militaries to this day are quite interoperable. I mean, there's Canadian military personnel serving within the U.S. in various capacities, and the reverse is true as well. So very, very close cooperation.
Something that's important to our organization is Canada's great support for Israel. Prime Minister Harper is one of Israel's best friends in the world. Maybe you can comment a little bit about the Israel-Canada relationship. Sure.
Well, it's been a friendly relationship for as long as Israel has existed. Canada place a lot of importance on it. Israel stands as a real beacon for democracy and freedom in that part of the world. It's an important economic relationship, well over $1 billion in two-way trade, lots of people-to-people links that are extremely important. Some 20,000 Canadians live in Israel, and a very significant Jewish community in Canada, I think well over 300,000. So there's very strong links between Canada and Israel.
We've talked about, you and I, and this goes back to the energy security issue, about the Keystone Pipeline issue. What are some of your thoughts about Keystone?
Well, it's certainly been attracting a lot of attention, this particular proposed pipeline, but it's important to note that there's already at least 5 or 6 major pipelines that are linking Canada to the United States, and the history goes back to the 50s when a pipeline was actually built to move oil north from Maine to Montreal. So we have a good long history of pipelines interconnecting our two countries, and the Keystone XL pipeline is just one more chapter, an important chapter, but it is one more chapter in this important partnership. And I think the arguments for going ahead with this pipeline, the benefits are very strong. Energy security for the United States, economic benefits for the United States associated with the construction of the pipeline, but just as importantly, perhaps more importantly, is the longer range benefits of the United States companies with associated jobs participating in an important way in the supply chain that feeds these oil developments in Canada. And of course the trade relationship, whereby Canada being by far and away the #1 customer for what the United States sells to the world, is important, so that if the United States sources oil from Canada, you get an energy security benefit, but also because the way our economies are so closely tied together, the money essentially is recycled and stays in North America.
If you think about it, the pipeline is an apt metaphor for U.S.-Canadian relationships. It passes through the border unimpeded, important commerce flowing both ways, and reflecting the fact that there's great trust between the countries, that we can build important structures back and forth without fear of interruption from foreign powers or any other source too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's so much infrastructure, important infrastructure along the border that is important for both our countries, whether it's to move energy efficiently. And it's not just energy moving from north to south. Our electricity grids are extremely well connected, and oftentimes we are purchasing in Canada significant amounts of electricity from the United States. Similarly, natural gas in many places along the border is moving from south to north. But then you've got the railway linkages, which are extremely important, including in the state of Minnesota, where the line entering International Falls is, at least in 2010, it was the busiest incoming rail port in the United States. And that's an example of many of the rail networks. There's also important road networks that connect Canada and Minnesota, Canada and the United States more broadly, which helps companies do all this cross-border business and sustain and grow their supply chains, which are so important to jobs and growth on both sides.
I heard a report on public radio about the great tug of war between International Falls and Fort Francis, I think over July 1st or July 2nd or something along those lines. Another expression of goodwill between the communities.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, there's a lot of goodwill across the border, and a shared recognition that the relationship is so important for both countries, and the family links, the baseball teams and hockey teams that go back and forth, tourists that go back and forth. I mean, just to the state of Minnesota, last year, almost 1 million Canadians visited Minnesota. And they came to see Twins games, they came to see Vikings games, they came to shop at the Mall of America, they came to take in the sights of Duluth, they came for all kinds of reasons. They came to do business, to invest in the state, all kinds of links.
North Dakota, South Dakota, too, are very important to our territory and important to your territory, too. I know the portal corridor for the CP Sioux line through North Dakota is an extremely important part of the interchange between goods and commerce between Canada and the United States. Is there anything specific that you want to tell us about South Dakota, North Dakota, and Canada?
Well, just like for Minnesota, the Dakotas look to Canada as their biggest export partner. North Dakota, Canada, the trade numbers are really big. North Dakota sells more to Canada than to every other country in the world combined. There's important energy linkages. Some of the pipelines that come from Canada into the United States pass through North Dakota. The proposed Keystone XL pipeline, one of the reasons that that's important is not only the benefit that it offers to the United States to bring in oil in a secure fashion from Canada, but it also offers an opportunity for this rapidly expanding Bakken oil production to get transported to the refineries in the Gulf. So this is why the governor of North Dakota, the governor of Montana, where the Bakken fields are strongly supportive of the Keystone XL pipeline. And that pipeline will continue. It actually doesn't go through North Dakota, but in terms of where it enters the United States, but it is very important to North Dakota. Other Canadian pipelines are running through North Dakota now. Canadian pipeline companies are involved in projects within the state of North Dakota to help move Bakken oil production to markets. The proposed Keystone XL pipeline, along with the existing Keystone pipeline, go through South Dakota, where there's many important benefits associated with that. But if you look at South Dakota, you go to the Badlands, you go to the Black Hills, Mount Rushmore, you're going to see a lot of Canadian license plates on the streets, on the roads. A lot of Canadian tourists come there. There's north-south business linkages, on the eastern part of the state along the I-29 corridor. Companies in Brookings and Sioux Falls that are and in those general areas that are selling all kinds of things to Canada, whether it be Daktronics and their big scoreboards, which are in many important stadiums and arenas in Canada, or there's a company that makes fire trucks in South Dakota, for example, that's been doing very well in Canada. So lots, again, just like with Canada, Minnesota, there's lots of really important Canada, North Dakota, and Canada, South Dakota business links.
We in Minnesota have had the good fortune to host you and your family now for 4 years. What are some perhaps highlights of your stay or your posting to Minnesota that come to mind as you prepare to return to Ottawa?
Well, there's been a lot of good memories. Our family has enjoyed very much living in Minnesota. One thing, in 2010 we celebrated the 40th anniversary of our office. Canada opened a consulate in Minneapolis in 1970. And so we marked the anniversary in 2010 in a number of ways, and we were delighted that, for example, that the Minnesota legislature passed a resolution, well, both chambers in the legislature passed resolutions honoring the Canada-Minnesota relationship and the anniversary of our consulate. I was invited to speak to a joint session of the Minnesota legislature, and that was an incredible honor and privilege to be able to do that. Similarly, we worked with our partners in the legislatures and the administrations in South Dakota and North Dakota last year in 2011 to have similar celebrations of the relationship between Canada and those two states. And that was a real honor for me and for our whole office, in fact, to be involved in those activities.